Hello, it is day 9 of Who Was Walt Disney. So chapter 9 is called The Strike. Snow White made so much money that Roy and Walt bought 51 acres of land for a new studio in Burbank, California. Here's a picture of California, and Burbank is down here. Okay, so they bought a ton of land because they had all this money now. In 1940, everyone moved into the complex. The company was now a big business. There were hundreds of employees. The animators worked in one building, and inkers, painters, and special effects artists worked in another. Walt thought that his employees would be happy to leave their old, cramped spaces and work in modern, air-conditioned buildings, but he was wrong. In the old days, all the Disney employees worked closely together and felt like a family. Now, they were separated from each other. People rarely saw Walt. There were complaints that the studio felt like a big factory. On top of that, once again the studio was having money trouble. A lot of money came from selling Disney cartoons to theaters in countries all over Europe. But since 1939, World War II, had been raging in Europe. The market for Disney's films were dried up, so Roy had to cut wages, and this made employees angry. They said they would stop working if Walt and Roy didn't listen to their complaints. Walt held a meeting and tried to calm people down. It didn't work. On May 29th, 1941, hundreds of Disney workers went on strike. That meant they refused to work until their demands were met. They stood outside the studio entrance, shouting at anyone who dared to go to work. When Walt drove up each morning, workers screamed and banged on his car. The strike lasted 9 weeks. It upset Walt terribly. He believed that the Disney studio had always been fair to employees. He felt betrayed. His health suffered again from all the stress. In early August, he went to South America. While he was away, Roy settled with the strike leaders. The employees got their pay demands. But the strike changed Walt. He refused to see that any of the workers had honest complaints. He was very bitter. Then, in September, his father Elias died. Now both Walt's parents were gone, and his next full-length cartoon, Dumbo, was about a flying elephant, and was not the success Walt was hoping for. And it came out in October of 1941. Everything changed at the studio after December 7th, 1941. That was when the Japanese army bombed an American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Now the United States was in the war too. American soldiers were fighting on 2 fronts, in the Pacific and in Europe. The U.S. Army took over Walt's studio. Training films for soldiers were needed. Walt had a hard time feeling creative doing this kind of work. Walt used Donald Duck in several cartoons for the U.S. Army. In one, Donald plays a skinny American soldier who becomes a hero. In another film, Donald Duck is living a miserable life in the Nazi Germany. At the end, it turns out to be a bad dream. Donald wakes up safe and happy in the United States. This kind of film was to make Americans feel proud of their country. I'm going to read the quick little part about Pearl Harbor. On Sunday, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed a naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The surprise attack destroyed U.S. warships and planes and killed 2,400 people. Americans were shocked by the news. President Franklin Roosevelt declared war on Japan the next day. 3 days later, our country declared war on Germany and Italy. World War II ended in Europe in May 1945. Japan did not surrender until August 1945, after the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. All right. And now we're continuing. The war ended in 1945. Walt could now go back to making his own movies. Several live-action adventure movies came out, but audience didn't like Treasure Island, Swiss Family Robinson, or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea as much as they liked Snow White. One Disney movie, Song of the South, made many people angry. The main character is an old African-American man named Uncle Remus, who lives in Southern Plantation. The NAACP, an early civil rights organization, which we learned about in our last read aloud, felt the movie made the lives of slaves seem happy, even though the film was set after the Civil War had ended. Black Americans were very upset. Critics said Walt Disney was out of touch. Walt turned to make nature movies like Sea Island, stories that filmed real animals, but had a made-up story. Walt did not pour his heart into these films the way he had with his classics. Maybe making movies was starting to bore him a little. Or maybe it was because Walt was already thinking about the next big thing. And that is where we'll stop. So I wonder what the next big thing is if it's not movies. I'll give you a hint so you can think about it for tomorrow. The next chapter is called A Fantasy World. So think about, what could he be creating now? Anybody have any guesses? I have one. All right, guys. I'll see you tomorrow so we can find out what that fantasy world is.